Thank you for inviting me. We are talking about winter protection, which is quite important here in Minnesota because we are at least in this area, zone 4B, and we get pretty severe winters. Just a note, one thing I would highly recommend is that you go onto the American Rose Society website. They have changed. ARS.org now gives you a 404. You need to go to rose.org and search for winter protection, and you'll get a wonderful article by Diane Summers, who is the currently the president?
Current president.
Okay, so when she was the vice president, she made this article. And I've copied much of the information from it, plus some observations of my own. So here in Carver County, you're in zone 4B. We have all the way up to zone 3 in the northern areas. I believe you are in zone 3. And so you get even colder than our -25 to -20. We also have high heat in Minnesota, high humid heat. So a lot of our rose challenges are keeping them healthy throughout the year, because a rose that is healthy going into winter is much more likely to survive the winter than one that is highly stressed over the fall. And if you are going to search for purchasing roses, they are all rated by hardiness zone, at least here in the United States. A lot of the roses that our first speaker mentioned were florist-style roses, our hybrid teas, floribundas, and grandifloras. Those are most likely going to be zone 5 or higher, which means that they are not going to survive our climate without protection. There are some roses that the companies are labeling zone 4 that are only marginally hardy in here. So unless you have experience with that particular variety, I would recommend, if it's a zone 4, to at least protect the crown of the rose, and we'll be talking about that later. So winter causes damage in 3 ways. The first is dehydration. On my property, that's the worst part. I'm in the heat island of the Twin Cities, but I also live at the bottom of a very large hill that we have probably average between 10 and 20 mile-an-hour winds every single day. Basically, the terrain funnels all the air directly onto my front yard. And so I have things that are supposed to be hardy in zone 2 that I have lost because the strong winds dehydrate them. And fortunately, there's an easy way of dealing with that, but I didn't know that I had to do that until I got to my property. The second part is simple freezing. Creating ice crystals within the rose canes breaks the cell wall. All plants have cells that have some sort of rigid structure, and if that structure gets pierced by an ice crystal, the cell is dead. And you will see that action if you look at rose canes that have died down partially. There's a middle area between the very dry dead and the green healthy that's kind of a brown, icky, moist cane. That's where you can see the ice crystal damage at that point. And speaking of rose pruning, always prune down below that point into healthy green cane, or that rot can continue throughout the year and damage the cane below. And then finally, probably the worst part of my property is animal damage. This year I had, well, one side of the property, they're building a new house and they dropped a tree on my deer fence. And so I have deer literally hopping over what was an 8-foot fence and is now about a 5-foot fence. They're in. Everything was nibbled to the ground. I'm going to have to completely restart anything that was in ground. You can also have damage, as we heard earlier, from rabbits, red squirrels, depending on your area. If they have enough food, they usually don't resort to roses, but if it's a really hard winter, they will eat the cambrium layer out of the rose cane, and that will, of course, kill the rose from that point up. Mice and voles are probably the most common pest that are going to take problems with your roses. One of the things that we're doing is creating a relatively warm space to the rest of the environment. It's very, very comfortable for the little mice and voles to sit in our boxes that we make for the roses and be warm rather than out elsewhere. So unfortunately, we need to pest control even in the winter. Next one. So winter protection actually starts when you're planting the rose. Here in Minnesota, the recommendation is to plant. So one thing we didn't see earlier that I thought was going to be in is the difference between an own root rose and a grafted rose. I don't have an image of an own root rose, but a grafted rose is going to have a swelling. The part of the rose that is below that swelling is going to be a hardy, well, relatively hardy rose that provides vigor for the cyan, which is the variety of the rose that you're trying to grow. The bud union is where they put the bud and then once it grew, cut off the head of the rootstock. If you look at planting guides from places like California, they will tell you that you want to plant the bud union 2 or 3 inches above the soil so that you don't ever get roots from the cyan, which sometimes will be less vigorous than the rootstock. Here in Minnesota, getting roots from the cyan is actually a good thing because it helps improve the overall root structure. One of the more important things is to make sure that you get at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. My property is changing. I have neighbors to the north that have very large maples, and so my main rose beds are getting to the point where I am going to have to change the type of roses that I grow in them. As said earlier, the albas, for instance, are a little more shade tolerant. There are some Austins that are a little more shade tolerant. And then also just accepting the fact that some of my less shade tolerant roses aren't going to be as prolific bloomers as they used to be. We heard a wonderful thing about fertilization that keeps the plant healthy, and again, healthy rose in survives winter much better. Fungal diseases can take down the vigor of your plant. Unfortunately for us, black spot is a major problem here in Minneapolis and surrounding areas, and Depending on how badly black spot comes, it can defoliate your entire plant, and while it will bring new leaves out to replace those leaves, that's sapping energy that could be put into the canes, which are the things that need to survive the winter. And speaking of fertilizing, taper off fertilizing, as an earlier talk did, so that we allow the roses to go dormant. Another note on dormancy, one of the things that can be very challenging in our area is because we have experience of both high and low, there are sometimes falls where we have a very warm fall that is terminated by a sudden drop into winter. And that will cause more harm for your roses because they won't have enough time to take their energy and put it into sugar production for the canes, which is how canes are able to survive cold temperatures. Unfortunately, there's not much that we can do when that happens, aside from maybe applying some winter protection methods that you wouldn't necessarily apply to a rose that would be perfectly hardy in this area. If there's a sudden drop, maybe mulching the crown would be a really good idea for that year, because the rose hasn't had a time to acclimate to the new shape. So some strategies for winter protection. Of course, the easiest is select roses that are going to be hardy in this area. The Canadian Explorer series is a wonderful series. They're a little hard to find outside of mail order these days, but if you want carefree roses, they are really the best series to go, although the Canadian Shield series with 49th Parallel series is another one. Chinook Sunrise is just gorgeous, and so long as deer and rabbits don't take it down to the ground, you'll have a beautiful rose. That the only thing, I'll talk about that later. A lot of the rugosas are going to be hardy here. There are a few that are zone 5-6. Again, always look at your tag or check on the ARS rose site, or helpmefind.com/roses to find if the particular rose you're looking at is an outlier for the rugosas, because you can get ones that are zone 6, and they of course will disappoint you. A lot of the David Austin roses are really good. Some of them are quite hardy in the area. Greg Thomas, let's see, Heritage. Sophie's Rose is gorgeous. I read that one. And those will be beautiful. You don't have to touch them. Most of them are moderately hardy here. You will have canes that die down to the snow line, or maybe down to the ground. This year, many of my Austins, that we had a fairly hard winter, and it was only by looking and saying, yep, we do have a little bit of growth from that dead stem, and they came back. They come back beautifully. Those are good options. Own root roses are very helpful, because the thing, while I say keeping the canes alive is the goal, the real goal is keeping the roots alive if it is a own root rose. There are some marginally hardy that will die to the ground every year, but they'll come up beautifully. And also some old garden roses are good for this area, an earlier talk gave. So I have a confession to make. I grow all of my hybrid teas in pots. As I mentioned earlier, my sunshine has moved, and so most of the areas that get adequate sunshine have decks on them. So I put all of my roses that are not going to be terribly hardy in the ground or get enough sunshine in the ground on the deck in pots. This is not my solution. This is actually Ken Lovely. He's another member, but he has had zero loss of potted plants. He has an unheated garage, although it isn't attached to garage. And they made this insulated box for all of his potted roses. So potted roses will not survive just left out. The soil will hard freeze all the way and kill the roots. Doesn't matter how hardy your rose is, it's just going to die if you leave it outside. So you either need to bury the roses if they're tender, or move them into a shelter. A couple of things to think about if you're moving them into a garage, an unheated garage. You probably want to try and get them off the ground. Concrete is a surprisingly good heat transfer medium, and it can suck the heat right out of your pot and damage your roses. So just throwing them on top of some cinder blocks with a board, keeping them off the ground will help. You also want to make sure that you don't have a direct wind from the door when it opens. So just adding a tarp to help with that will help as well. Am I missing anything? Oh yes, they do need water if you bring them inside. And actually, I didn't have a slide on inside. While you can bring roses in if you have an extremely sunny location, you are going to have mixed results. One of the things that will happen if you bring the rose inside is you are likely to bring pests in with it. The couple of times that I've tried it, I have had the little red spider mites. Once you get into the dry, warm area of your house, the spider mites, if they're there, will cover the entire plant and kill it right off. So I don't recommend bringing roses into a heated area just for those reasons. One of the easier ways to handle marginally hardy roses are to use mulch to protect them. The first example is just putting a collar of fencing around it, and using oak leaves in particular are good because they keep their structure during the winter and will not mush down, which can cause problems later. The one on the left is my front bed. I just gather all the leaves into the paper leaf bags and surround all the canes. That actually works pretty well with the Austins. Just be aware if you do that, in the spring the bottom of the bag will have already rotted away, so you'll need to tip them over. Don't assume you actually have a complete bag when you're done with that. But that actually works quite well for keeping the canes alive. Some other things, as I mentioned, my property, I have to be very careful of wind throwing up the canes. There are products like Wiltproof which help keep water from evaporating out of the canes. It's helpful in some ways. You're probably going to have to reapply in the middle of winter because the weather will take it away, but if you want a light duty, that might help it might not. Covering the plants, however, for a windbreak is very helpful. I got some shrub covers, I think from Bachman's, that basically are a flat, long piece that you wrap around the plant and tie, and that windbreak is all it takes to keep a beautifully healthy rose when you have heavy wind conditions. I haven't personally seen those particular covers, but I believe they would also work quite well. Mounding and mulching. So if you know that you have tender roses, one of the things that you can do is add a soil around the crown and then add some mulch on top. This would work well for marginally hardy roses. I don't think I would trust a tender rose to this here in Minnesota. Maybe if you were down in Iowa, yes, but maybe not here. Rose cones. Some people don't like them at all. I find them very useful. Again, with my somewhat hardy or hardy but in the windstorm. The big benefit of them, you're really not changing the temperature inside of that cone by, if you have negative 20 degrees outside, within 2 hours, the inside air of that cone is going to be negative 20 as well. What you are doing with these is keeping the wind from desiccating the roses. And it also slows down the temperature swings, which is helpful as well. Especially during the spring, one of the things that causes damages to the canes are the freeze-thaw cycles. Just like our roads, the same thing happens to the cell walls of the plants. So if they have not stored enough sugar in their cells to keep them from thawing and freezing, that's when they'll mush. It's good to have some air holes in them, because again, you're not insulating them from the temperature, you're insulating them from the wind. And you can have mold problems if you leave cones on too long in the warmth. I've never had that problem here, but that could be because I'm lucky. But especially for marginally hardy, I find it very useful. And of course, you do need to weight them down because any breeze will blow them away without it. One of the things that has been used by some of our club members is deep planting. And that is for both own root and grafted roots to plant the roses much deeper than you normally would. And that is dropping them a good 3 to 6 inches below where you would normally plant a plant. Essentially, if you if your rose is already leafed out, in other words, you bought a potted rose, you can still do this. You dig your deeper hole, but you only fill the soil in up to the soil level of, or maybe up a little bit higher if there aren't any leaves in that area. So essentially, the first year you'll have a rose in a hole. Looks weird, but at the end of the year, you fill up to grade level, and in all cases, if you're using this method, once the roses go dormant, you cut the canes off at ground level. And what that is doing is all of the canes that exist under the ground are going to be protected from moisture loss. They are going to have not nearly the ambient temperature of the outside to cause cell damage that grows down in. And then in the spring, the buds on the canes sprout, and you get canes coming up. Your bloom cycle will be about 2 to 4 weeks later than everybody else. I believe the Lawsons use this, and they're quite successful. So it's an option. The book that I read that talked about this method suggested also, when you're burying the rose, to put a length of PVC pipe with holes drilled into it down in the soil, so that you can water through that pipe and get fertilizer and water down to those rows or the roots that are much deeper than the plant is used to being in naturally. Insulated boxes are essentially the same thing as rose cones, just on a larger scale. I've used this quite successfully in previous years. You simply stake the rigid styrofoam insulation panels around the bed that you want to protect, put a top on it, and for at least zone 5 and marginally hardy, it seems to work quite nicely. Again, noting both for rose cones and insulated boxes, you need to put down rodent poison, or you're making a lovely winter home for rodents, and they will girdle all of your canes because you have provided them a lovely sugar-filled treat to eat, and that's going to kill your rose. Perhaps the most successful strategy that we have here in the Midwest is to use concrete blankets. Pretty much every club member that I know uses this method to one extent or another. Essentially, you cut the canes down to 6 or 8 inches, and you can also put your potted plants on the side in the center of the blanket, and then you place bricks to keep them from blowing away, and it's easy peasy. And I don't know if Anne does this with other plants such as Japanese maples, and it works.
I leave my roses about 24 inches.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I use wooden sawhorse and some of the concrete blankets. I have custom made blankets to cover them, and they come through fine.
Yep. Yes, if you ever have or see that Lois Ann is doing a garden tour, by all means go, because she's the rock star. A couple of things, you don't want to put this on too early, because you do want them to get dormant as they can be, and you don't want to open them up too early either. Let's see, what am I missing? I think that's it for this, but well worth the investment in getting blankets. This is what everyone used to do before we came up with the concrete blanket, and that is the Minnesota tip. And this is the absolute most back-breaking way of doing it. It's very effective, but basically you bind your canes together, you dig a trench right next to the rows, you use a garden fork to loosen the roots, you tip it over, you bury it, a little tip, make sure that the twine that you're using to bind the roses stays out of the trench when you bury it, so that you can find it in the spring, and reverse in spring. It is a major pain, and I'm too old for that right now.
And some concrete blankets.
Yes, concrete blankets, so much better. And now my way of dealing with, I am related to engineering, and I always try to find the best technological solution to a problem, And mine was that I insulated a 10 by 12 shed, put a horticultural thermostat in it, and attached a heater. It's probably cost me between $50 and $150 a month, but my roses do not, in the pots, do not freeze at all. I keep them at 35 degrees. And this allows me to protect even some zone 8 tea roses, and they're just happy to be there. The important thing again is I need to water them frequently. I have had years where that has escaped me and I've lost some gross stuff. Speaking of red squirrels, I did have a red squirrel infestation because this was a giant warm place for them to live. And there are two ways that you can deal with that. The first is to make sure that you feed heavily outdoors with like your bird feeders, and I always have a tub of corn for them. Or you are going to lose roses because they will nibble off that tasty, sugary Cambian layer and girdle the rose, and they're gone. So I choose to sacrifice food and keep them well fed so that they don't resort to the rose canes. This, as I said, works beautifully. There's always some attrition, but very, very little of it. Final thoughts, every winter is going to be different. You're going to want to watch your weather reports. If there's going to be a sudden drop from, the worst case scenario is a very warm fall that suddenly drops away to sub-zero. We've had that a couple of years in a row, and you're going to want to do more protecting than you think you ought to in those cases. If it's a year that's going to behave, then the normal is going to be adequate. And again, don't remove protection too early because we do have late frosts, and if the rose gets started and it freezes, the tender, it's put energy into the system that might not have enough energy to push out another one. Any questions?